Good evening. Welcome to the Margaret Diddams Annual Lecture on Faith and Learning. I'm Christine Colon, Professor of English, and I am standing in for Tim Larson, who is the Director of the Faith and Learning Program. He's currently on sabbatical, so I am taking his place this evening. My job this evening is to open with prayer and also to provide a short history of the Faith and Learning Program at Wheaton College. So let's begin with prayer. Please pray with me. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this opportunity to come together this evening to celebrate the long tradition of faith and learning at Wheaton College. Thank you for all those who have come before us and established a strong foundation of faith and learning that we who teach at the college now can build upon. Thank you for the ways that we have been able to glorify you through our research and teaching. Bless this time, Lord, and help us to learn from our colleague, Dr. Aimee Callender, as she helps us to see how she integrates faith with her field of cognitive psychology. In Jesus' name, amen. Now for a bit of history, and I will confess that I am borrowing a lot from Dr. Tim Larson, since he is the historian. But I want to talk a little bit about the Faith and Learning Program at Wheaton College. It began as a summer intensive program for faculty in 1969. Professor Emeritus Dr. Leland Ryken was a member of that very first cohort, and he credits it for providing a strong foundation for his long and very productive career as a teacher-scholar. While not everyone who has gone through the program has been quite as productive as Lee Ryken, who has published well over 50 books, the program has continued to help faculty reflect deeply about various ways that they can integrate faith and learning in their disciplines. While I don't have time to discuss all of the people who have helped develop and maintain the Faith and Learning Program throughout its history, I'd like to share with you a few highlights, beginning with some of the directors of the program. In 1974, Dr. Arthur Holmes, the founder of our philosophy department, began directing the program, and in the next 2 years, he published 2 books that have become foundational works for thinking about the integration of faith and learning: The Idea of a Christian College and All Truth is God's Truth. Other illustrious leaders of the program have included Dr. Alan Jacobs and Dr. Roger Lundeen, and currently, Dr. Tim Larson. All the directors of the program not only have helped incoming faculty reflect deeply on the value of integrating faith and learning, but have also guided them as they have worked to apply this knowledge to their own disciplines. The success of the program must also be tied to the support that it has received from our provosts. In 1997, Dr. Stan Jones made it a priority to deepen and strengthen the program, enabling the creation of the extended version of the program that is our current model. Currently, the program not only includes a junior faith and learning seminar in which faculty in their second year at Wheaton College meet weekly over the course of a year to discuss various books and to hear senior faculty share their experiences with faith and learning at the college. But it also includes the advanced faith and learning seminars and the supplemental seminars that are open to all faculty. In addition, the program sponsors or co-sponsors various lectures and conferences designed to help promote faith and learning across campus, helping, for example, to bring Marilyn Robinson to campus a few years ago. Having such a robust faith and learning program is impossible without the funding to support it, and we're thankful for the donors over the years who have helped us not only maintain, but also to develop and deepen this program, enabling it to be a model of faith and learning to institutions in the United States and around the world. Tonight, we are celebrating one particular component of the program, the Faith and Learning Paper, which is a significant rite of passage for all Wheaton College faculty, and one that our current president, Dr. Philip Ryken, also chose to complete upon becoming our president. Many of these papers have gone on to be published in peer-reviewed journals and have played an important role in shaping conversations about faith and learning in many different disciplines. This lectureship, which began in 2019 as a means of celebrating the 50th anniversary of the work of the Faith and Learning Program, was the brainchild of our then Provost, Dr. Margaret Diddams. It is highly appropriate, therefore, that it now bears her name. As Dr. Tim Larson has stated, Margaret Diddams is an experienced, gifted, eminent leader in Christian higher education. She is passionately and thoughtfully committed to rigorous Christian thinking across the disciplines and to the true full integration of faith and learning. In her time as provost from 2016 to 2020, Dr. Diddams strongly supported the Faith and Learning program, and she's continuing her influence on faith and learning in Christian higher education through her new role as editor of Christian Scholars Review, which is the premier journal for scholarship that advances the integration of Christian faith and learning. As President Riken has remarked, Margaret Diddams is a champion for a Christ-centered liberal arts education who will leave an enduring legacy at Wheaton College. This lectureship is just one component of that legacy. I am very pleased that Dr. Diddams is able to be here with us tonight to share with us her vision for the lectureship and her thoughts about faith and learning. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Margaret Diddams.
Well, good evening, everyone. I want to thank the tens of tens that are here in Barrows, and for those of you who are watching via Zoom or whatever platform we're using now. I am so honored to have this legacy as part of my time here at Wheaton College, and I just want to take a couple minutes to share with you my vision for faith and learning and for this lecture. As Dr. Callender mentioned, and thank you for your very kind words. I have to compartmentalize the joy I'm feeling right now with the seriousness of my words. But this lecture is a celebration, as you noted, Dr. Callender, of more than 50 years of the Faith and Learning Seminar at Wheaton College. The early 70s was a remarkable time for the examination of what it meant to be a Christian scholar and to do the work of Christian scholarship, which, as Dr. Callender mentioned, much of the work was spearheaded by Wheaton's own Arthur Holmes. 2 years after the launch of this seminar, Christian Scholars Review was publishing its first issue in 1970, and in 1975, Arthur Holmes published The Idea of a Christian College. Since then, it has become almost a rite of passage for senior scholars, presidents, and provosts to write on the topic of Christian higher education, Christian scholarship, or the Christian scholar. The Christian philosopher Nicholas Wolterstorff wrote extensively in this area, and I highly recommend his 2004 book, Educating for Shalom. In his 1988 inaugural address at the Free University of Amsterdam, titled The Project of a Christian University in a Postmodern Culture, he described an interactionist approach to Christian scholarship that emphasized conversation between faith and science, broadening knowledge in ways that had been limited in more traditional compatibilist, harmonization, or perfectivist models of integration. While Wolterstorff did not eschew explicitly Christ-animated scholarship, he did not privilege it. He said, "The general goal of the Christian in the conversation of science will not be difference but fidelity, not scholarship different from that of all non-Christians, but scholarship faithful to Scripture and to God in Jesus Christ." I believe in the idea of faithful scholarship, that Christians who conduct research that is not explicitly tied to the Bible or Christian theology are still faithful in their work. In my own field of psychology, research on gratitude, happiness, well-being, character, humility, authentic leadership, free will, and purposeful work has been done by Christians who have investigated important social questions that have bearing on faithful living. But I also believe that there is a pressing need for scholarship that is explicit in its dialogue between Christian faith and one's academic endeavor. The world desperately needs Christians in the public square. This is not just presenting and publishing our scholarship within our guilds, but the need for us to serve as public intellectuals. Our truth claims must be present to serve as a corrective to the wreckage of the post-truth world. Institutions are different from mere organizations when people look to them to shape their own normative beliefs. Wheaton is an institution, and people are interested in what Wheaton has to say. More explicit scholarship is also needed in our guilds. Most of our fields have given up on any normative claims apart from utilitarian exigencies. As Christians, we not only hold to truth, but we hold to the proposition that since all truth is God's truth, then truth matters. It is this worthy pursuit by the Christ follower that sets us apart from many of our peers. And lastly, since truth matters, how we live into truth matters. Over 40 years ago, I sat in chapel, my freshman year, watching my first fall convocation. As the faculty marched in, robed in their regalia, I thought to myself, these are people of integrity. Much has been written in defense or critique of the term integration of faith and learning, but I believe that part of that dialogue has missed the point. Integration as the dialogue between truth claims shapes integrity, an accord among our personal and institutional beliefs, intentions, and actions. The scholarship of faith and learning is more than an academic exercise. It is also about individual and communal character formation. For 50 years, faculty at Wheaton have practiced this integrity through their faith and learning papers. These remarkable works of scholarship are a milestone for faculty as they approach promotion and tenure. As provost, I wanted to elevate this work in our campus community. Working with Dr. Tim Larson and with the generosity of an anonymous donor, we created this lecture to honor one of the finest papers approved in the prior year. I also wanted to add that, as we all know, we have an embarrassment of riches when it comes to off-campus speakers. But we could do better in honoring and listening to our own, especially those who are doing outstanding work early in their career. And I am pleased that this lecture can serve this purpose. Before Provost Lee introduces Dr. Callender, I want to say how grateful I am to have this lecture named in my honor and hope that it will have a lasting influence here at Wheaton. I also want to add that reading and approving all these papers over the 4 years as your provost was excellent preparation for taking over the editorship of Christian Scholars Review. And on that note, after going through Wheaton's own rigorous editorial process, I do hope many of you will submit your manuscripts to Christian Scholar Review. I would look forward to moving them through the review process. Provost Lee.
It's such an honor and a pleasure to follow in your footsteps, Emeritus Provost Dittums. And a great pleasure and joy to introduce our featured speaker tonight, Dr. Aimee Callender, Associate Professor of Psychology and recently tenured. Congratulations. I first had the honor of meeting Dr. Callender in my first few months at Wheaton, when she and Dean Terry Watson guided me on a socially distanced tour of the psychology labs in Billy Graham Hall. I was impressed and delighted by Dr. Callender's enthusiasm for team-based teaching and faculty-student collaborative research. As a cognitive psychologist, Dr. Callender's primary research area involves investigating individual differences in reading comprehension and developing interventions to improve comprehension and memory of text. Dr. Callender describes her scholarly expertise as falling within Boyer's category of integration of knowledge, which is scholarship that dwells at the boundaries where fields converge. Dr. Callender's research in reading and cognition is interdisciplinary and includes projects with researchers in second language acquisition, teaching college physics, and safety engineering. As a cognitive psychologist, Dr. Callender brings current research about teaching and learning into the classroom to promote student learning in engaging ways. Dr. Callender has published many peer-reviewed journal articles that investigate the connections between the basic principles of memory, reading comprehension, and meta-comprehension, and additional fields including education, applied linguistics, and industrial engineering. Dr. Callender's selected faith and learning paper, the original title, which is The Function of Longer-Term Memory in Relating to God, an examination in the Old and New Testaments, was selected by Dr. Margaret Diddams, our beloved Provost Emerita, as the paper to be presented at this inaugural Margaret A. Diddams Faith and Learning Lecture. In praise of Dr. Callender's paper, Dr. Diddams wrote, "I really appreciated the way that you wove the biblical narratives and cognitive research together in true integration, rather than review the psychology and biblical passages separately. I especially like the three very different topics associated with memory. While the veracity of eyewitness accounts in the Gospels would seem the natural connection between the two, I found your writing on memory and covenant and memory and forgiveness to be the most thought-provoking." Dr. Diddams additionally praised Dr. Callender for creating a dialogue between psychology and biblical texts. I am just thrilled to introduce to you our featured presenter for the inaugural Margaret A. Diddams Faith and Learning Lecture, Dr. Aimee Callender.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Dr. Lee, and thank you for the opportunity to give this lecture, Dr. Diddams. So as Dr. Lee said, that the title of my paper is looking at the function of memory in our relationship to God. So let's begin. So tomorrow is my daughter's 10th birthday, and as I was talking with people before, she is bouncing off the walls. And I think about the last 10 years of memories with my daughter and with my son. I think about birthdays. I think about throwing rocks into large bodies of water like this one. Fortunately, they don't fall in too often. I think about them learning, getting frustrated. I remember marching them around the house to get them to fall asleep at night. And all of these memories that I have of them contribute to who I know them to be today and our relationship. So the question is, what happens if these memories disappear? What does that mean for how I relate to my children? I'd have a really difficult time relating to them. I wouldn't know what to expect in situations. I wouldn't have a foundation for our relationship. And so in the same way that as humans, if we don't have memories of our relationships with other people, we have a difficult time functioning in our relationships. If we don't have memory of God and who he is and what he's done for us, we'll have a difficult time maintaining a relationship with God. And so the premise of my talk today is that memory enables us to return to the story of God's faithfulness to his people, Jesus' sacrifice, and the works of the Holy Spirit throughout our lives. Further, these memories allow us to not only know of God, but to be in relationship with him. So what I'm going to do in this talk today is I'm going to talk about 4 different things. First, I'm going to talk about integration as a cognitive psychologist. I'm going to introduce what cognitive psychology is, because I think a lot of people just don't know really what it is. And then I'll talk about how I approached integration. And then I'll take the topic of memory and approach it as a cognitive psychologist to understand the covenants and promises in the Old Testament, eyewitness testimony in the New Testament, and then forgiveness. So, what is cognitive psychology? Cognitive psychology is the study of human information processing. It looks at how we pay attention to information, how we recognize objects, how we remember, how we solve problems, make decisions, and communicate. And the basic assumption in cognitive psychology is that our minds are sort of like little computers. And in fact, the original research in cognition was really using the computer as a model for our minds. And so with that assumption, we don't really worry so much about everything going on around the person. We don't worry about their history. We're just looking at the mind as a computer. The brain is important, but we're really not so much concerned about the brain as these larger systems and developing theories for how we process these different pieces of information. And so the big question is, how do we study these mental processes? And this is where sometimes you can imagine I ran into a little bit of difficulty beginning just the process of integrating cognition with Christianity. When we study human mental processes, we use things like accuracy. I give you a list of words and ask you to recall them, and I see what % of the words could you recall accurately. We use measures like reaction time. How many milliseconds does it take you to respond to one stimulus versus another stimulus? We have people make judgments about how they're going to perform on a task, and often those judgments don't actually match up with their real performance. And we use measures like transfer, seeing if they can use their knowledge in one situation in a new situation. So these are pretty limited methods. We use these methods to make inferences about what's going on in the mind, and we often look for converging evidence from multiple methods. But in some ways, they're pretty limited, and a lot of people have criticized cognitive psychology for using really what we call impoverished materials. We use lists of words. We use individual pictures. We don't look at really complex situations because we're trying to strip away as much as possible to look at what is sort of universal across humans and how they process information. To sort of like hammer this point in a little bit more, I'm going to show you a couple examples of what we do. So this picture here, this is called the serial position curve. And in this kind of research, what we do is we give people a list of 15 words. We institute a short delay, 3 seconds, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, maybe even 30 seconds, and then we have them recall the list. And what we see is that items at the beginning of the list are recalled pretty well. Items in the middle of the list are recalled not so well. And then we see another increase at the end of the list where they recall the information pretty well. This is accuracy data, simple accuracy data, but from a simple experiment like this, psychologists were able to develop pretty sophisticated theories about human memory, and that we have two different basic types of memory. We have long-term memory, which is represented by the beginning portion called the primacy portion of the curve. So the first 3 items that are remembered well, that's information that has been successfully transferred into long-term memory. Information at the end of the list that's remembered well, that's called the recency portion of the curve. That's information that's still in short-term memory. Information in the middle is out of short-term memory and has not successfully transferred into long-term memory. And so again, simple experiment, but we create these sophisticated theories from them. Another simple example, this is one of my favorites, it's called the lexical decision task. And this is looking at reaction time. So how long does it take you to decide if a word is a real word or a non-word? And I'm going to have you do this with me. So you're just going to tap on your lap, if a right hand if it's a real word, left hand if it's a non-word. So it's pretty exciting. Let's get started. Tree, flirp, hoist, train, duvet. Okay, you got off easy there. Usually if you were doing this in a real experiment, you'd be doing 100 words at a time, or maybe more. Now, from that simple experiment, we're able to look at how words of different frequencies in the English language lead to different reaction times. High-frequency words like the word tree or chair, we respond to very quickly. These are milliseconds, so it takes us about half a second to respond to the word chair or tree. Very low-frequency words like duvet take a little bit longer, a couple hundred milliseconds longer. Now, that's still a very short amount of time that we're talking about, but this is a significant finding. It's a robust finding that you find over and over again. And then things like non-words like flirp, that actually takes less time to respond to than a very low-frequency word like duvet. So what this tells us is it tells us something about how we organize information in our minds, how we categorize these different words, and also how we make decisions. So again, very simple experiments using reaction time, we can create very sophisticated theories about human information processing. But you can probably see how I ran into a slight problem here in terms of integration. What does it matter in terms of your faith when you're looking at the milliseconds it takes for you to respond to a stimulus? You can do that kind of research without being a Christian and come up with the same results that you would as a Christian. So in terms of thinking about integration, I sort of got a little bit stuck. And so I did what a lot of academics do, is I started reading. And started reading about the integration between Christianity and psychology. And I ran into another wall in that the majority of literature that's published on the integration of Christianity and psychology looks at clinical psychology. And Dr. Bill Struthers conducted a study in 2005 where he looked at the published literature and found that less than 10% of the literature on the integration of Christianity and psychology looked at any type of experimental psychology. Cognitive psychology is just a small portion of that. I did a cursory glance at the literature since then, and there has not been a substantial increase. So I had to sort of step out of my cognitive psychologist's shoes and try and figure out, okay, what else can I do? How can I approach this question? And started thinking about, well, what are our cognitive processes for? And a lot of our cognitive processes are for communication, allowing us to relate to each other. And so from there is where I developed these ideas about the functions of our memory. And actually very recent research in cognition in the last 2, 3, 4 years have actually started looking at the function of memory and realized that the function of our memory is to allow us to relate to God, and specifically the ideas I'm going to talk about today. Remembering God's faithfulness to his people, remembering Jesus' death and resurrection through eyewitness testimony, and then remembering God's forgiveness. So I'm going to jump into the Old Testament here. So in the Old Testament, God made covenants with Noah, with Abraham, with David, with Moses, and the people of Israel. And in these covenants were initiated by God because he loved his people. These were agreements that were made on through affection. He loved them. These weren't like orders that he was giving them, you must do these things. No, he loved them, and so he created these covenants with them. And as part of these covenants, both God and the Israelites had to remember specific things in order to be able to carry out the covenant and live under the covenant. And so there are two specific ways that memory played a role in these covenants. First, the Israelites had to remember what the promises were that God made to them. And second, they had to make choices about how they would live daily based on life under the covenant. So we see memory involved in keeping the covenants, and we also see the Israelites' failures in keeping the covenants and forgetting God's promises to them. And one scholar said that memory is the most instrumental guarantee of covenantal fidelity. So it was absolutely critical for life under the covenant. So how does memory play a role in the covenants? Well, let's look at God's covenant with Abraham. God says, I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So these are God's promises. God says, I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants after you for the generations to come, to be your God and the God of your descendants after you. But then God goes on to say, know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. So the Israelites had to remember God's promises for 400 years. How did they do that? Well, this is where my knowledge as a cognitive psychologist comes into play. And we're going to look at retrieval cues and how they play a role in different ceremonies and feasts that are part of the covenants that God made with them. So I'm going to start with the memory literature, and then we'll shift in looking at what that means for the covenants. In memory, we talk about 3 basic memory processes. We have encoding, which is getting memories into our heads, into our minds, our brains. We have storage, which is maintaining that information over time. And then we have retrieval, which is getting the information back out again. Memory cues are basically things that point to that piece of information that you're looking for in your mind. So if you have God's promise in your mind, you can have lots of different cues that point to that promise in your mind. These cues can be internal cues, other information that you learned about at that same time, other just information that's connected to God's promises. And we can also look at memory processing. And the idea being that if you can have the same memory cues and processing at both encoding and at retrieval, you're going to be more likely to successfully remember the information. I'm going to show you an example of how these memory cues work, just to give you a little more concrete look at this. So this is a made-up memory network. And let's say this is what your mind looks like when you're thinking about dogs. So you can think about your dog, and when you think about the dog, the concept dog, it becomes activated. And you have all these other related concepts, pets and cats and puppies and mammals, and they're all connected with each other. Now, these connections differ in that some of them are stronger than others. The thicker lines are stronger connections, And they also differ in terms of the number of connections from one node to another. So some of the nodes, for example, dog, has lots of connections going to it, whereas bison only has one connecting to it. But when I think of the word dog or the concept dog, that becomes activated, and that activation actually spreads to other related concepts. And so what we can see here is that husky and golden retriever and labs and puppies, they all get activated. And then we see this dotted line from dog to mammal. That's a weaker connection. Mammal still actually becomes activated. But what's interesting, it doesn't show up super well in the yellow though, is that the concept horse, it receives a little bit of activation from mammal, a little bit of activation from pet, and it's because it's the additive effects that you can also think of the word horse when you think of the word dog. Now this is obviously made up, but this is just a sample to show you how our memory networks function. So the more cues that you have pointing to the word or the concept you're trying to think of, the more likely you will be to remember it, and if you can have the same processing at encoding and retrieval. What does that mean to have the same processing at encoding and retrieval? Students know this intuitively. The first question they always ask when there's an exam is, what is the format of the exam? And they want to know that because they're going to study differently if it's a multiple choice test versus an essay test. If it's a multiple choice test, they're going to study isolated facts. If it's an essay test, they're going to study things in a more integrated fashion. That's exactly what we're talking about here. The way that you're thinking about things needs to be the same at encoding and retrieval. And so I suggest that covenants facilitate memory by providing consistent retrieval cues and by reinstating the same mental processes at consistent times throughout the year. So again, let's return to the covenants. In Genesis, God says, "This is my covenant with you and your descendants after you, the covenant you are to keep. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You are to undergo circumcision, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and you." So God set up this covenant so that every time a male child is born, in every generation, they're going to have a consistent reminder of God's promise to them. So this is a retrieval cue to remember God's promise. The Passover is an excellent example of retrieval cues being used to facilitate recall of the covenant. God says, "Obey these instructions as a lasting ordinance for you and your descendants. When your children ask you, 'What does this ceremony mean to you?' then tell them, 'It is a Passover sacrifice of the Lord, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt and spared our homes when he struck down the Egyptians.'" God is telling them, this is a way for you to remember what I did. And when we look at what the Passover is and what the Passover feast looks like, there are so many retrieval cues pointing back towards God's promises. There are visual cues, the food there, the physiological cues, the smell of the bread, the taste of the bitter herbs. We have behavioral cues or actions that can point back towards God's reminders, as a reminder of God's promises. So all of these different ceremonies and rituals and feasts basically act as retrieval cues pointing back towards the fulfillment of God's promises. Now, one other thing that we can think about in terms of memory is that there were people who were alive when God made these covenants, but the Israelites had to remember for 400 years, and we still remember today. And so again, through these covenants and the rituals and the feasts and the ceremonies that God set up, different types of memories are created. So in cognitive psychology, we talk about the difference between episodic memory and semantic memory. Episodic memory is the kind of memory where you have a specific event tied to that memory. So you can think about, I remember seeing the Eiffel Tower in Paris. So there's a specific episode, you can mentally travel back in time and re-experience that event. So for the people who were alive when God made those covenants, they have episodic memories of what God did, passing over their houses, for example. It also creates semantic memory, which is general knowledge that you just accumulate over your lifetime. Semantic memory can be thought of just, I know that the Eiffel Tower exists, or I know that the Eiffel Tower is in France. And so through the covenants, each generation basically, and each individual, as they celebrate the Passover, for example, each year they create a new episodic memory of God's faithfulness. They also create over time these semantic memories. Those memories together combine to create what we call an autobiographical memory. Autobiographical memory is memory, it includes episodic memories, semantic memories. It also includes things like procedural memories, our sense of self and who we are. And so if we're talking about autobiographical memories, we think about who I am. I am this person. And so because of God's promises and because of these covenants that he made and these episodic memories and these semantic memories that are created, the Israelites could form the autobiographical memory of I am a child of God. Now, the final covenant I want to talk about from the Old Testament, is God's covenant with Noah. Now, this one's a little bit different. In this covenant, God says, I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Whenever I bring the clouds over the earth and the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenant between me and you and all living creatures of every kind. So in some ways, you could read this and think, does God need a reminder to not flood the earth again? So, that's one interpretation. It's probably the incorrect interpretation. But from a cognitive psychology perspective, we can look at this and think about, well, rainbows appear frequently. They're a naturally occurring phenomenon. They occur all throughout history, quite frequently all over the world. And from a cognitive psychology perspective, we know that repeatedly retrieving information and repeated exposure to information strengthens that memory. So for God to use this naturally occurring event that happens frequently, it just strengthens that promise of his that he made to his people. Additionally, scholar Chalmers noted that remembrance is not just about bringing something to mind. It's not just about remembering, but it's about action. And so in the context of this covenant, this means that the rainbow functions as a prompt for God to carry out his plan to preserve humanity. So this doesn't just mean that he's going to keep his promise, but that his faithfulness will be constantly renewed and strengthened, even though his faithfulness is already absolute. But the sign of the rainbow provides us with the absolute assurance of God's work in our lives. So now I'm going to look at the New Testament. So in the incarnation of Jesus, we see the biblical narrative and the fulfillment of the prophecies in the biblical narrative. The incarnation and death and the resurrection of Jesus brought all of us into God's family. And so part of this, though, is that for those of us living now, we must believe in Jesus without physically interacting with him. And the way that we know who Jesus is and the way that we know about his life and his works is through the eyewitness testimony of those who lived at the time of Jesus. And this causes some problems for some people. So in the cognitive psychology literature, there has been extensive research that has looked at the fallibility and the malleability of memory. And this is all mostly done within the context of the U.S. criminal justice system, where you need to know exact details of particular events to be able to know if somebody should be convicted of a crime or not. Researchers have delineated a number of different ways that our memories can fail us. Daniel Schachter at Harvard wrote a book called The 7 Sins of Memory. And these sins range from memory failures such as transience, so it's just forgetting due to time, absent-mindedness, where you just don't really encode the memory because you're not paying attention to things. It also includes more serious memory failures, like misattribution, where you have the source of a memory and you attribute it to the wrong source. So I think I learned about something from one news source when in fact I learned about it from another news source. There's also suggestibility, where you have an existing memory and later information gets incorporated into that memory, and now you don't know what the original memory was. It can also include things like bias, where memories change. They become either more positive or more negative over time. And these are pretty problematic in the context of, for example, the U.S. justice system. So, as a cognitive psychologist and thinking about integration, I sat down and I started to read about how different biblical scholars have dealt with this memory literature. And they have taken two different approaches. One approach is to take this literature and use it as a way to question the veracity of the eyewitness testimony in the Bible. The result of that is basically a dismantling of Jesus' life, message, and the gospel truth. Now, this was obviously slightly problematic for me as a Christian cognitive psychologist trying to understand how we can apply memory to the Bible. So I kept reading, and I found another approach which was sort of equally problematic for me, in that other scholars just completely threw out this research and said, well, the limitations of cognitive psychology is done in the lab. They try to implant memories in people, and yes, we do that as cognitive psychologists. We try to put false memories in people's minds. But those limitations means that we can't use it to analyze the historical accuracy of the Bible. Both of these approaches were problematic for me as a cognitive psychologist. Neither of them seemed to really take what we know about cognition and use it in a way to actually understand the Bible. So I put my cognitive psychologist shoes back on and decided to use the lens of cognitive psychology to analyze what's going on in the scriptures. And when I did this, my goal was to determine whether the types of memories that we see in the Gospels are consistent with what we know about memory today. And I actually did find one scholar who took a similar approach, and I just want to provide one quote to show you his approach as well. Bauckham says that trusting this eyewitness testimony is not an irrational act of faith, which sometimes you start feeling like it is when you're reading these critical scholars of this research. It's not an irrational act of faith that leaves critical rationality aside. It is, on the contrary, the rationally appropriate way of responding to authentic testimony. So Gospels understood as testimony are the entirely appropriate means of access to the historical reality of Jesus. So in approaching the New Testament, I looked at two different basic phenomena in memory research. I looked at schemas and gist memory. So schemas are mental frameworks that we use to interpret the world around us. A really simple example that I like to use is we have schemas for restaurants. My schema for a fast food restaurant is I walk in, I order at the counter, I pay, I get my food, I sit down, eat, and clean up after myself. So I have this framework, and I know what to expect in that situation. Similarly, I can have a framework for another nicer restaurant where I go, they seat me, they take my order, they bring my food to me, I pay after I eat, and they clean up after me. So these schemas facilitate our memory because basically we just have to be able to fill in the details in the slots in that schema. So the next time I go to a fast food restaurant, I just fill in the details. I don't have to remember the whole thing. That can cause some problems, though, in that if there's a slot that doesn't get filled, we may fill it in with information that didn't actually happen. And then we have some problems with, well, what if information doesn't fit in that schema? And what we actually find, though, is that information that doesn't fit in the schema is actually remembered a little bit better. And so I'll use this picture up here of this office as an example. So this picture of this office is from research that was done in 1981 by Brewer and Treyans. And what they did was they had participants study this picture. And then later they had them recall or do a recognition test of what they saw. And people remembered typical office items, desks and chairs and shelves and bulletin boards. But they also found that people tended to remember books, and there were no books in this office. So from their mental schema of office, they misremembered books. But then what would happen, for example, if there was something like a stuffed giraffe in that office? Well, because that didn't exactly fit into that mental schema of office, you would actually remember that a little bit better. So let's hold on to that idea for just a second. Another concept I want to talk about in terms of cognitive psychology is gist memory. So gist memory is just what it sounds like, where we remember the gist of a situation. We remember the overall meaning or message of a situation, and we lose the details of that. And actually, a lot of research on reading comprehension shows that when we're reading, if we actually form a good mental representation of that text, when we form a good gist representation of that text, the details are gone. Same thing with memory for other types of information. Back in the 70s, researchers Bransford and Franks had people read sentences, and again, these are very simple, impoverished materials, like the ant was on the table, and the ant was eating the jelly, and then had people indicate later which sentences they read. And most people misremembered reading the sentence, the ant was eating the jelly on the table. Now, right, they understood the gist of those two sentences, and they just basically combined them together. Now, from a memory research perspective, that was wrong, But from an overall message perspective, yeah, they understood the message. And so these are the two concepts that I want to carry through looking at the New Testament. So in the New Testament, schemas are obviously at play. Schemas are greatly influenced by our culture. And memories are often distorted to fit in with our cultural expectations. Original research on this was done by Sir Frederick Bartlett back in the 30s, and he had students in Britain read a story from a native Canadian folklore, and then he had them repeat the story over and over and over again, and he found that basically they took this Canadian folklore and fit it to their British expectations. And in the original story, there was a young man who went off to fight a war with some ghosts, and he ended up dying at the end of the story. But these British students remembered it. By the time they recalled it multiple times, they misremembered it as this young man was the hero and he survived. And so basically they changed the story to fit with their cultural expectations. And so in the New Testament, we have a situation where the Jews have certain cultural expectations. They have a schema for what the Messiah will look like. Their schema included things like the Messiah would be a political leader. The Messiah would be victorious. And so if we look at memories of who Jesus was based on what we know about schemas, we wouldn't see what's in the Bible. We would see people misremembering Jesus as a political leader that would bring justice, that would have confronted the political leaders at that time. We don't see that in the scriptures. Similarly, if they were to misremember Jesus based on the schema that they had, they would misremember Jesus possibly as avoiding crucifixion some way, or somehow surviving crucifixion. But they don't misremember Jesus that way. They remember him being put to death and being resurrected. In fact, Jesus' death was so contrary to their schemas that N.T. Wright notes that for the Jews at that time, a dead Messiah was a failed Messiah. So what happened in the New Testament was completely different from their expectations. And so from a memory perspective, if they were to remember things, it wouldn't be what's showing up in the scriptures. So undeniably, they had this Messiah schema, and it was still in place as you move through the scriptures, but they didn't misremember Jesus. What had to happen was that their interpretation of their schema had to change because he so wildly violated their expectations. Another way that we see schemas at work in the New Testament is through what's called minimally counterintuitive concepts. So this is like the giraffe in the office. Things that just slightly violate that schema. And so again, if we were to misremember who Jesus was and what he did, or if the Jews of the time were to misremember, they would misremember him as interacting with political leaders, as engaging with leaders and so on. They would not misremember the events that show up in the Bible, such as Jesus talking with the prostitute at the well, Zacchaeus the tax collector, these outcasts in society. They wouldn't misremember accidentally or somehow a bleeding woman touching his coat to be healed, or him interacting and healing lepers. So again, from these schemas, we actually can probably be more confident that these events happened because these violated their mental frameworks about who Jesus was. Finally, with just memory, I'm going to just show you one example from the Synoptic Gospels in terms of how we can look at two different passages within the Gospels and see differences in the Gospels, right? They're obviously different. One in Mark is much longer than Matthew. They're telling the same story about Jesus being at the Sea of Galilee and healing the deaf man. And so basically, this raises questions for us. Can we trust these Gospels? They're different. They tell us different things about what happened. But from just memory, we can look at these two accounts. And in Matthew, we're getting a general level account. We're getting a gist account of what Jesus did. In Mark, however, we're getting a lot of detail. And so what happens, again, from a memory perspective, if I'm looking at these recollections of Jesus from my modern day research approach in terms of memory, I would look at Mark, and assuming all those details are correct, I would say Mark has a more accurate memory. But if I'm concerned about the goals of the writers here and what they're trying to tell us, which is telling us about who Jesus is and who God is, then both of them are telling us basically the same information, that Jesus healed this man and that we should glorify God because of it. And so, therefore, one must consider the goal of the writing to determine the accuracy. And so it really just highlights the difficulty of applying our modern conceptualizations of memory to historical ancient texts like this. But what we do know for sure is that the gospel accounts reveal patterns of recall that do correspond to what we know about human memory today. All right. The last section of the talk that I want to move on to is looking at memory and forgiveness. So we know that throughout scriptures that God is a forgiving God. All throughout the Old Testament, God is forgiving his people. The Psalms are replete with verses about God's forgiveness. And we know that Jesus also instructs us to forgive others. And so forgiveness is a really central part of our lives as Christians today. Now we hear this phrase, well, forgive and forget. And so I actually approached this section of thinking about integration from this phrase of, can we forgive and forget, or should we forgive and forget? And this is where we can actually use the methods of cognitive psychology to investigate a question that comes out of Scripture. So, in terms of the psychology literature on forgiveness, Dr. Everett Worthington talks about the process of forgiveness. And he says, actually, remembering the offense is the first step to forgiveness. So we don't want to necessarily forget, because then we can't truly forgive the person if we've forgotten the offense. So first we must remember the offense. And then he talks about two different forgiveness processes. We have a decisional process where we decide cognitively, I'm going to forgive this person. And then there's the emotional process where we let go of the hurt when somebody hurts us. And so my question as a cognitive psychologist is, we know memory is malleable, we know it can change, and so what happens to our memories when we forgive somebody? Well, there are two different primary ways that I think our memories can change during the forgiveness process. One is through the process of what we call intentional or goal-directed forgetting, and the second is through the process of bias. Intentional forgetting is pretty much what it sounds like. You decide, I'm going to forget something, and if you try and recall it later, you're not going to recall it as well. In the laboratory, what we do is we give people a list of words, say we want you to remember these words. After we read the list of words, we say, oh, you know what, sorry, I read you the wrong list, forget that list. You really need to remember this other list, and then we read them another list of words. And then we test them on both lists. And what we find is that memory for the list that they were told to forget is worse than memory for the list that they were told to remember. And so based on your goals in a particular situation, this is why the more general term is goal-directed forgetting, we can choose to forget certain information. And so through this process, this forgetting process, it reduces interference, it reduces sort of other information getting in the way, and it allows us to remember other more relevant information. So in the forgiveness situation, if you have a goal of maintaining a relationship with a person, it makes sense to sort of get rid of the memory of the hurt and be able to focus more on the memories of your positive interactions with that individual. So this is one place where researchers have actually studied memory in this way. So two different researchers have done this. In laboratory-based research, what they typically do is have people read scenarios of people doing something harmful to another person, hurting them in some way. And so Sell, in her research, she had participants read the scenarios, and then she said to intentionally forget some of the scenarios and remember others. And then later on, she asked, how likely would you be to forgive people from these different scenarios? For the scenarios that they were instructed to forget, they actually had a higher rate of forgiveness for those scenarios. So if you forgot it, you are more likely to forgive them. Noreen actually did the opposite. In her research, she had people read the scenarios and then decide whether or not they're going to forgive the person in that situation. And then later on, she tested their memory, and she found that the scenarios where people indicated they would forgive somebody, they remembered less of that information later on. So in these situations, we could see memory could actually change sort of in two different directions, and this could be an area for future scholarship in integration, seeing how memory actually does change as a function of forgiveness, maybe for real life situations. Bias is the other way that our memories can change. So I mentioned bias briefly earlier, but basically what happens with bias is that our memories change to become either more positive or more negative, and generally what happens is we have a goal of self-enhancement. We want to make ourselves look good now. That's what this goal is. So if that means I want to distance myself from who I was in the past, I'll make myself look worse in the past to make myself look better now. If my goal is to show consistency with my past self, then maybe I'll make my past self better and make it more positive to match up with who I am now. And so again, if we think about the goals of an individual when they're forgiving somebody, if their goal is to maintain a relationship with that person, they may have a different type of bias than somebody who has a goal that does not involve maintaining the relationship. So if you want to maintain a relationship, you may bias your memory more and maybe forget more of the hurt and have a more positive memory of that person in the past. If your goal is just to forgive and not maintain a relationship, you may not bias your memory as much. But one thing I want to note is this is not an intentional process. We're not sitting here thinking, I'm going to change my memory of this person. This is an unconscious process that happens in order to allow us to have this self-enhancement or to allow us to be able to maintain this relationship. And so from this research and from these concepts of bias and intentional forgetting, goal-directed forgetting, what we see is that the malleability of our memories, which is often thought to be problematic, actually serves an important function. It allows us to forgive and maybe not forget, but perhaps to remember differently. And so from all of this, we see that our memories are intricately linked with our knowledge of who God is. And although our memories are not perfect, they do maintain the critical information that's necessary for us to meet Jesus and believe in him. And it's through the functioning of our memories that we can be in relationship with the living God and build and maintain relationships with the body of Christ here on earth. And so finally, it's through our memories that we have knowledge of promises that have been fulfilled. And it is because of all of this knowledge that we can be confident in the fulfillment of his promise of a new heaven and a new earth. Just to end, I would just like to thank Dr. Diddams for this opportunity, and then Dr. Tim Larson, who's not here tonight, and also Dr. Aimee Peeler and Dr. Bill Struthers for reading this paper and helping me through this process. So. I think we do have time for a few questions, so if anybody would like to ask a question, please stand up. We do have the microphones out there so you can be heard. Yes, Ray.
What role do you think there is for implicit memories, right? So a lot of this is about explicit memories where I can actually recall some amount of detail from this past event, place myself in it. But when someone gets amnesia, we wouldn't say their entire memory system is broken. We would say they can't have an explicit memory about the past, but they can have implicit memories. They might fear some situation that was painful in the past, but not know why. Mm-hmm. What role would you think there is for implicit memory in relationality between us and God?
Can you repeat the question for the
Yeah.
audience?
So the question is about, so implicit memory is different. That implicit memory is memory that we're not aware of and that we can't talk about. And so a lot of times in cases of amnesia, you lose your explicit memory, which is what I was talking about here, these memories that we're aware of, but your implicit memory is often still intact. And so the question is, what role does implicit memory play in this? I think a lot of times it is difficult for a relationship, for example, for people who have amnesia, it is really difficult for them to have relationships because they've lost that awareness of that relationship with that person. But like you mentioned, Ray, you do have these responses to things that still exist, and sometimes you're not sure why, because that implicit memory still persists. And I would think it would be sort of the same way here, that if you've had a good relationship with God in the past, and then you lose those memories of who God is, you could still have that awareness of that relationship in the past, but I think it is going to be more difficult because you don't have that explicit awareness. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, Sarah, go ahead.
Could you say a little bit more about just how that forgetting works when you want to forget something?
Yeah.
I mean, is it replaced by something else? I mean, what is that?
Yeah, so the question is, how does that intentional forgetting work? And this is one of those places where they're still developing the theories. The idea is generally the information isn't completely gone. It's just that connection between the information is weakened and the connections with other information is strengthened. And so it's likely still there somewhere, but just not as strong of a representation, and it's harder to get that information back. Yeah, so that's generally how it works in the memory literature. Yeah, Bill.
A lot of the memory research is down to sort of remembering things in the past, but if memory is informing the present as well and our relationships with God and with each other, unpack a little bit how memory might be important for projecting into the future. So for example, like how might hope fit into kind of a memory framework that you're talking about?
So the question is, so I've been talking about memory in terms of the past, but what is its role in the present and then possibly the future and something like hope? So this is a great question. This is something actually left out of the talk just for time purposes. Very recent research in cognitive psychology has shown that the areas of the brain that have to do with episodic memory or past episodic memories are the same areas of the brain that allow us to have thoughts about future episodes. So if I want to imagine something in the future, I'm sort of using the same areas of the brain that I use when I'm remembering the past. And so I think that and there's a lot of research showing that, for example, older adults who have difficulty remembering the past, they have difficulty imagining future events as well. And so I think these memories of the past are essential for us imagining and thinking about what God is going to do for us in the future as well. So, great. Well, thank you very much.
So don't turn off your computer just yet. Just a few closing words. That talk was super. I feel like I learned so much over the last hour. Really what integration of faith and learning is all about, taking us deeper into an academic discipline. I don't know very much about cognitive psychology, so I learned a lot in that area, but also just a new way of thinking about the reliability of the Gospels, the importance of memory in the Christian life. So we're so grateful to you, Dr. Callender, for an excellent talk tonight. Great to have Margaret Diddams with us. We're so proud of your work at Christian Scholars Review, Margaret, and glad to hear that you will look with favor upon submissions from Wheaton College faculty. And just such a great legacy to have this annual lecture. We're also really grateful to our audience, the audience in the room, which I know Dr. Callender has appreciated tonight, but also those tuning in over the internet. If you really wish that you could have been here tonight in person, you'll have another opportunity next year, when we hope that you will join us for the next installment of our annual Dittums lecture on the integration of faith and learning. God bless you, and good night.